This is episode number 151 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest today is Charles Lachman. Since 1998, Charles has been the executive producer of the nationally syndicated news magazine Inside Edition. He has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, History Channel, Lifetime, C-SPAN, and other local and national media. He's also the author of 4 nonfiction books and 1 crime novel. I invited Charles onto the podcast today to discuss his newest book titled Codename Nemo: The Hunt for a Nazi U-Boat and the Elusive Enigma Machine, which was just published on June 4th, 2024. It's the story of an almost impossible mission for the U.S. Navy to locate, disable, and capture a mostly intact U-boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and the men who pulled it off. It's also the story of the crew of the German U-boats themselves, the hardships they endured, and how they nearly turned the tide of the entire war itself. But before we get into this story, I want to let you all know about an educational tool you're not going to want to miss. It's the Gray Man Briefing Classified. By now, I think I know my listeners pretty well, and take it from me, this briefing is exactly the news and educational reference source that you've been looking for. You'll get breaking news updates from all over the world on topics including planned protests and riots, low-intensity conflicts, natural disaster alerts, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and more. You'll also get access to articles that help you build your own skills, including urban survival, home security, counter-surveillance, escape and evasion techniques, and more. And this is much more than just a newsletter in your inbox. Joining the Gray Man Briefing Classified also includes invitation-only channels on the Telegram and Signal apps for convenient real-time updates. The newsletter subscription is normally $5 per month, but if you use the code GBCSpycraft, you can save 20% each month for the life of your subscription. I'm already a member myself and have been reading and learning a lot since I first subscribed. Look it up yourself at graymanbriefing.com. That's gray with an A, graymanbriefing.com. And use the discount code GBCSpycraft to save 20% right from the start. Charles, thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you, Justin, for the invite, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I've heard a lot over the years about how important the Enigma machines were to both sides during the war, but until I read your book, I hadn't realized just how incredibly difficult it was to actually capture a working machine, because I was coming at it from always knowing that we did so successfully. So this was a real page turner for me and a great history lesson as well.
Well, you're right. The Allied forces had captured a number of Enigma machines prior to June 4th, 1944, but the Germans kept ongoing innovation, and they were always improving their machines. So it was very important to get the latest version of the Enigma machine that was in operation at that time.
Yeah, incredible opportunity there. And it sounds like they exploited it to the fullest, which I'm sure that we're going to talk about here in a minute. And I have to tell you before we begin, Charles, that you did something in your book that I very rarely see, because I read about a book a week typically for the podcast here. And that is that you did not have to kind of estimate or take a guess as to any of the dialogue in the book. As I think you put it right there in your foreword, that every single word of dialogue in your book comes straight out of the historical record, which is super impressive to me, because so many times I've seen these, conversations that are essentially invented in these historical works of nonfiction, but you didn't have to do that. So that was just really great to see. Very heartening, honestly.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yes, no, all the dialogue is as it was recollected by the participants. Some of the battle action was actually recorded by the U.S. Navy in 1944. So it's word for word verbatim in terms of the battle plan when they attacked the U-boat.
Yeah, fantastic. And in your book as well, you have some really just thrilling photos. And I assume that there's some black and white footage out there that's not in print, of course, but it was just very, very exciting to see and really feel like you were there as things were coming to a close for U-505, as we're going to discuss.
Right. It's interesting that Captain Gallery, who I know we'll talk about, the commanding officer of the USS Guadalcanal, the genius behind this extraordinary raid, he had a Navy film crew on his aircraft carrier filming the entire raid. Just think about that. I mean, he had such a keen sense of his place in history if the raid had succeeded. So he made sure that there was a Navy film crew. So it's all on tape, which is pretty amazing. It reminds me of that great line from The Right Stuff, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. Captain Gallery was a self-promoter, I'll have to say that, but he was a brilliant strategist, and he knew that his place in history was assured by just not the raid, but by recording it for history.
Fantastic. Yeah, he was quite a character, no doubt about it. So, Charles, what was it that led you to choose this as the subject for your next book to begin with?
I was searching for a topic, something that was big and important, and I have to be honest, I was struggling a little bit. I mean, I have a full-time job and a half here at Inside Edition as the executive producer. But Thanksgiving a few years back, my wife and I were visiting our daughter in Chicago, and her boyfriend at the time wanted to keep the parents entertained, meet the parents kind of situation. And he prepared this entire excursion for us in Chicago. At the top of the list was a visit to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. And the most popular exhibit there is U-505. Now, I got to be honest, I'm pretty good at history, but I had never heard of this raid before or of U-505. So I was very, very excited to see this. I couldn't quite understand. I mean, they have a German U-boat in the basement of the museum. So we follow the signs to U-505 exhibit, and you go lower and lower and lower. And by the time you get to level 4, which is as the very bottom of the museum, you step into this extraordinary display. There it is, a giant U-boat. And I just couldn't believe it. And my first reaction was, what is a German U-boat doing in a museum in Chicago? My second reaction was, how do they get it in the basement? And then I turned to my wife and I said, this is my book. That's how it all started.
Amazing, amazing, great story. And I was aware, I was vaguely aware of this story, but I was not aware that it was in Chicago until I read the book. So when I looked up the photos, and having not seen it in person, just the photos online are breathtaking, honestly. So I can't imagine what it's like to see that. I definitely will be stopping by the museum next time I'm anywhere near Chicago.
It's so worth a visit there. It's extraordinary,
Fantastic.
particularly when you go inside on one of the tours and they show you around and you see how tightly confined the space is. And you can't imagine that there are 59 people, sailors who lived there in World War II.
Hmm. I'll bet. I have been on board an American submarine. It was, I think, the USS Dolphin at Pearl Harbor. It's out of the water. It's right on the shore there. And that was a great experience for me. That was not that long ago. And it was amazing to me because even though it's fully cleaned up, everything is, clean and shiny and painted white or brass inside, and there's only you and, 8 or 10 tourists at most, it still feels incredibly claustrophobic in there. So I can't imagine being, 100 feet below the surface. You've been down there for a month and a half. Everybody is, sweaty and disgusting, and you haven't seen the sun, and you're all sickly from breathing the stale air. It's just hard to imagine living that life. But these guys did it, and they almost turned the tide of the war. So I can see how it's such a thrilling subject to focus on.
One of the interesting things about the story is that after the Americans took it over, and after it had been, we'll get to this, I'm sure, after it was brought to U.S. shores, American sailors went on board and they were struck by how tight the bunks were. Now, the German U boat was built, for the average European male, and submariners tend to be on the shorter side. The tallest person, a man on U-505, was 6 feet, and he was like a giant
Hmm.
compared to the rest. So the Americans are obviously, bigger and bulkier and taller, and they were struck by how confining the cots were and everything else about the U-boat.
Oh boy, I can imagine. So we've mentioned the Enigma machines a couple of times, and I think people have probably heard of them at the very least. But can you explain why this was such a significant asset for Germany and why it was such a significant target for the Allied forces?
The Enigma machine is basically a cipher device that's used to protect military communications. Before the war, it was used to protect commercial communications. During the war, it became vital to the German forces in preserving the integrity of their communications. And it looked like kind of a futuristic typewriter. It had keys that you type with, the 27 letters of the alphabet. And each time you hit a key, a light would go on. But behind the box was this a spaghetti of wires and 3 and sometimes 4 electromechanical rotors. And those rotors were positioned differently every day by a predetermined set. And they were able to scramble the letters of the alphabet into pure gibberish. And there were millions and millions of potential combinations. And the German high command, fatal mistake on their part, was they were so arrogant, they assumed that the Enigma codes were unbreakable.
Hmm. Amazing. I guess the only way for them to really figure out was to get hold of the box and the codes themselves. So you mentioned that other Enigma devices had been located. Were they destroyed, or just had the codes already been changed by that point? Like, why
Well,
was this still such a target?
right, that's a good question. The secret Nazi codes, particularly for the Navy, were changed every other week. So that's why it was so important to obtain the latest version of the Enigma machine, because the codes were constantly changing, but the Enigma machine stayed the same. And, as we now know, the great British mathematician Alan Turing, who's said to be kind of the founder of AI, had deciphered the Enigma code in 1941, but it required an enormous number of hours of primitive computer time to decipher. So the significance of it wasn't just the Enigma machine that was so valuable, it was also the secret code books. So if the Allied forces could obtain those code books, they could basically read the German messages in real time. They didn't need hundreds of hours of computer time in the US or in England to decipher. They read it as fast as they were sent out by the German High
Hmm.
Command.
Yeah, total game changer there, no question about it. And I think that there's a quote right at the beginning of the book, if I recall correctly, it's from Winston Churchill, and he says something along the lines of, "The only thing that he truly feared during the war was the U-boats." Is that more? Do I have it more or less correct?
That is correct. He feared it actually more than the Battle of Britain.
Oh,
It
wow.
was all part of the Battle of the Atlantic, which was the longest continuous military campaign in World War II. It ran from 1939 to the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. And it basically pitted the U boats and other warships of the German Kriegsmarine, which is the Nazi name for the Navy, against the British Royal Navy and the US Navy and Allied merchant shipping. And the main target of the Germans was not so much the warships, because they could fight back. They were interested in searching and destroying the merchant ships that were coming from North America and also from South America and the Caribbean. They were filled with oil and also war material supplies, and they were delivering them to the Brits and to the Soviet Union. They were also delivering planes and food. Remember, Britain is a island nation without much natural resources. So
Mhm.
these convoys were developed, these fleets of merchant ships that were carrying all these goods, and they were shielded by a screen of American and British warships that protected them as they crossed the Atlantic. And the goal of the U boat fleet was to penetrate these convoys and destroy as many of the merchant ships as possible. Also, another factor is that the Germans were well aware that the US and the Brits were preparing for the invasion of Europe for D-Day. And one important goal of the U-boat fleet was to stop the buildup of American supplies and equipment that were being shipped to England in preparation for the invasion of Europe.
Hmm. Yeah, of course. I mean, they could have kneecapped that entire operation before it began, months before it began, even. And it's horrible for me to think about, like, those crowded troop ships. They've got hundreds of guys on board, and just a single torpedo from an undetected U-boat can end so many lives, and turn the tide of the war, like you said. So,
I don't want to minimize the danger that the Allied warships face, absolutely, but they could fight back. They had depth
oh
charges, they
sure.
had mortar shells. Later on in the war, they had the planes and aircraft carriers. But the merchant fleet was really quite vulnerable. They had small arms on the top deck to fight off, and basically they were defenseless if they did not have these convoys surrounding them. And there was a lot, and I was frankly surprised at what my research uncovered in Codename Nemo, which was the fact that an awful lot of these merchant vessels crossed the Atlantic, or attempted to cross, without any protection whatsoever from Allied convoys. They were just basically on their own.
Yeah, I was surprised because you have several stories in the book from the participants themselves about that, and I was shocked that a merchant ship was just out there completely on its own with a handful of crew. I had always assumed that it was 30 merchant ships guarded by 10 U.S. Navy destroyers, or something like that, but clearly that was not the case, and those guys really, really were just sitting ducks. And even if you survive, even if you make it to the lifeboats, you're still out you're 1,000 miles potentially from land. Maybe don't even have a radio. You just have to kind of hope for the best. So it's a pretty daunting kind of risk for those guys to take, but so many of them did take it.
Very much so. Interesting to note that there were 10,000 merchant marines who were killed during the Battle of the Atlantic, and that represents a higher ratio of casualties than any other service in the U.S. Armed Forces during
Oh
the
my
war.
gosh, I didn't know that. Man, terrifying stuff. And they don't get the kind of respect that the uniformed services do when we think back to the World War II struggle. I mean, we know that it was a full, nation or international effort. Everybody was pitching in and doing their part. But if you're talking about thousands of guys died, I don't hardly ever hear about merchant marine sailors on Memorial Day, for example.
You're right. They are really the unsung heroes of World War II.
Hmm.
Interestingly, that Captain Gallery, that we'll get into him, I'm sure. One of the reasons why he was so determined to bring U-505 to the museum in Chicago, this is obviously years later, is that he wanted it to serve as a memorial to the merchant marines who lost their lives during the war.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that more. I find out if there's more memorials or anything like that, maybe in the ports. I assume for the merchant marine because I have not spent much time looking into that at all. So I feel like that's a little bit of a deficit on my part now. But yeah, absolutely the unsung heroes of the war effort, no question. So Charles, U-505, did it? It's the subject of your book, but before the attack, did it differ in any way from the other U-boats out there? Was it? I mean, what was its mission? Like, how many crew? What was it up to at the time of the events of the book?
Well, it was launched in 1941. It had a what I would call a respectable service record, not particularly memorable, good for the Allies. And they had a crew of 50 to 60 people, depending on the particular mission and the cruise. It was a hard luck ship or boat, rather. First, life on board, it was not meant for everyone. The food storage was really extraordinary. They had to bring enough food on board the boat to last for 3 months at sea. Imagine storing all that food in an impossibly limited amount of space. And there were only, I don't want to get too graphic on this, but there were only two heads, two bathrooms, but they
Ooh.
were not usable. They were used for storage. So you can imagine what they had to do when they had to use the facility. I won't get into that. And they had some degree of fresh vegetables on board, particularly in the early days of the cruise. But when they ran out, there was always a risk of scurvy breaking out if actually each of the guys of the sailors managed to smuggle in their own kind of supply of lemons that they stuffed into their pockets when they boarded the
Hmm.
boat when they set out from France. So life was hard. They had like 100 books in the boat's library. They had like 80 records of popular music. There was chess and card games that they played. Pretty much everyone on board was a chain smoker, but smoking was forbidden
Hmm.
inside the U-boat. So they had to smoke when the boat surfaced for a brief period of time, and they could only stay on top deck for 3 or 4 minutes it took to finish the cigarette, and then they were replaced by other crewmen who were waiting on the ladder to take their turn. And it was either, freezing or steaming hot, depending on where the boat was patrolling, like a steady drizzle of condensation that dripped on their faces. And just going back to the bathroom situation, the stench. I mean, one sailor on the U-boat described it as the equivalent of a cold, clammy coffin. There were six, as I say, 59 or so men on board the boat, but they only had 35 bunks. So they all had to be shared. It was called a hot rack. So when your shift started, you popped out of the bunk and another crewman hopped in to take your place. So the beds were in constant use 24 hours pretty much a
Golly.
day. The mattresses reeked of body odor, and the only officers who had their own bunks was the captain and the chiefs. So, and yet, despite this, I would have to say that morale on U-505 was pretty good. I mean, if you ever saw the movie Das Boot, from what I can determine from my research, it was an accurate depiction of life on board a German U-boat. It was filled with tension and drama, but there was a spirit at the core that kept these men going. They were very committed to the Nazi cause, unfortunately.
Hmm. Yeah, it's hard to imagine anybody volunteering for that kind of life, but it was critically important to Germany's war effort at the time. But I have to wonder how those guys stayed sane, with basically no privacy at all, no sunlight almost ever, having to give up cigarette smoking involuntarily for days or weeks at a time. It sounds like it was just a miserable life, even if you're doing something very important.
They were mostly volunteers, and I think one of the
Hmm.
reasons for that is that they were considered to be heroes in Nazi Germany. They went back and they wore the insignia of the submarine corps, and they were lauded. They were considered, I guess, the equivalent of in the U.S. of a fighter pilot, because the Germans and Hitler in particular really was they were counting on the U-boat fleet to bring about victory.
Hmm. Yeah, and they certainly came fairly close to that, as we discussed and as we know now. So I understand that although they had a decent reputation, like you said, that the original captain, Captain Lowe, was replaced after the or the boat's second tour. Can you talk about what happened there with the crew and with the captain?
Yeah, the U-505 had 3 captains during its existence, and as you point out, the first Captain Lowe was the first commander. He was just 32 years old. He was a graduate of the German Naval Academy. He had a couple of kids back home. He actually spoke pretty good English, and I would say he was a strong leader. The men looked up to him. They called him the Lion because that was his name. He had a decent record, but he made a terrible miscalculation. One journey, U-505 encountered what looked like a yacht off the coast of South America. For whatever reason, he decided to blow it up. And it turned out that the yacht was owned by a member of the nation of Colombia's diplomatic corps. Back then, Colombia was neutral in the war. That's a big no no. So when Lowe went back to France to dock U-505 on that mission, he was relieved of command. He also happened to be sick with a severe case of appendicitis that almost cost him his life, but he ended up no longer captain of
Hmm.
U-505.
Okay. Okay. I see. That's unfortunate for him. Kind of a blunder there with the yacht, to say the least. So, what about his replacement? What changed after the new captain came in?
Well, here we get into a whole arena of dysfunction that afflicted U-505. The second captain was named Peter Zesch, and he was just 24 years old when he took Lowe's place, and he was actually the German Navy's youngest U-boat captain. He had all the kind of pedigree that Nazi Germany would see in a U-boat commander. His father was a Navy doctor. He was a good looking guy. He kind of fit the Aryan super race model, but only cosmetically. He was never really cut out to be a commander. He was a heavy drinker. He was arrogant, imperious, mean spirited, and the crew really detested him. And in the book, I think one of the most riveting chapters is how he really brought shame to the German Navy. He was engaged in a real battle with a British task force of destroyers, and they were just pounding his U boat with depth charges, and he couldn't take the pressure. So he took a revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. He shot himself in the head during the height of this battle, and he became the first commander in the German Navy to kill himself under enemy fire. One of the interesting things about that episode is that the bullet didn't quite end his life. He was close to he had a death rattle, and his men were so worried that that rattle would be picked up by British sonar that they ended up smothering their own captain with a
Oh
pillow
my gosh.
to keep him silent. And that ended his life. And then, not long after, when they were able to escape the British forces, they surfaced the U-505, and they wrapped the Captain Zesh in a canvas. And the replacement, his XO, his executive officer, said, attention. And not one member of the control room crew, as the body was brought up the ladder, stood at attention. Even in that final moment when you think that they would pay their respects to the captain, they couldn't. They couldn't abide the fact that he would kill himself during a battle. So they deposited the body. He was buried at sea. Then the executive officer had to radio Berlin with the shocking news that the captain had killed himself. So they immediately ordered U-505 back to France, where the submarine was based, to investigate.
My gosh. Yeah, what an incredible twist and turn of events that was there. I can imagine the horror of the crew watching that happen and worrying that that would be the thing that had them discovered. The pistol shot inside a steel can like that, and the death rattle, if that was enough, sound to give away their position, then he was not just killing himself, he was killing his entire crew as well with his
Yeah.
actions. That's incredible to think about.
Yeah, totally. It really was the event that turned U-505 into a hard luck boat. It really led to a series of dysfunctional personalities and events that culminated in the seizure of U-505 on June 4th,
Hmm.
1944.
I can see that. I can see that definitely. So on the other end, that you mentioned Captain Gallery and the Guadalcanal several times. So how was he the originator of this plan? Did he just come up with this never before conceived of opportunity on his own? Like, how did that even arise?
Well, Captain Gallery it was such a delight writing about him. He was very interesting naval strategist. He was the son of a Chicago lawyer. He had two brothers who were also naval officers, and a third brother was a priest. In fact, his mother was a writer for the Archdiocese in Chicago. And Gallery was a graduate of the Naval Academy, did very well academically. He was, after graduation, assigned as an ensign, learning how to be a officer. He transferred to the Navy Flight School in Pensacola and became one of the first of the Navy flyers. So everything about his career was built to commanding a great aircraft carrier. And yes, he devised this crazy scheme, which he would even acknowledge was a cockamamie idea. He was inspired by a conversation that was taking place in, of all places, Iceland, where he was the commanding officer of the U.S. naval base. And he was, I have to say, a little bored with his mission. He felt that he needed to be, as all great naval officers are determined to be, he needed to be on a ship at sea. So he was stuck on this land base. And maybe in that frustration, the idea struck him. He was in the officers' club one night, and they were all chewing the fat. And some now unknown officer said, "Hey, what if we were to board one of these U-boats?" The idea simmered in Captain Gallery's head for years, really. It just stuck with him. He needed a few more years of experience in hunting and killing U-boats to finally kind of figure out whether it was feasible or not. But it was his idea. He dreamed it up, and he deserves all the credit that came his way in terms of the innovation and the brilliance of the battle plan that ended up working. It could have been a suicide mission, but it ended up
Yeah,
working.
certainly, certainly. So, how long had it been since the U.S. Navy had actually captured an enemy ship at sea under these kind of conditions?
The answer is the War of 1812. Does that take you back? And actually, that was an achievement done with a bit of an asterisk. A U.S. warship boarded a British vessel in, I believe it was off the coast of Indonesia. I hope I have that right, in 1814. But ironically, the war was already over, but that not had been received by the U.S. commander of that vessel. But yeah, it took 1814 is when was the last time that a U.S. warship boarded a enemy vessel in time of war.
My gosh, incredible! 130 years. Gallery accomplished something that nobody else had accomplished in 130 years. That's really stunning. But it's so different. You know, a wooden sailing ship, of course, versus a U-boat is vastly different. So, were they just working from a blank slate? Like, did they have any idea how this would work? Because I assume that a U-boat, of course, first and foremost, it can simply go down, can simply submerge, right? If it doesn't want to be found, and they have the ballast tanks and they have scuttling charges and all that. So, how do you actually get a U-boat to the surface and keep it there where you can board and take over the ship or take over the
Well,
boat?
right. We could jump ahead to June 4th, 1944, and I could describe what happened because that's exactly how it came about. I mean, there was a lot of thinking beforehand, a lot of planning. In March of 1944, Gallery set out with a task force consisting of, by then he was the commanding officer of the USS Guadalcanal aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier was screened by 5 destroyer escorts, and they set across the Atlantic, operating in the off the coast of the Azores and off the coast of West Africa, hunting and killing U-boats. And what Gallery had determined based on prior experience and prior engagements with other U-boats was that even the hardcore Nazis of the German Navy were determined to live out the war. They had, again, based on his experience, they did not want to be blown up in service of the Führer or the fatherland. They wanted to live out the war. And if that meant surrendering their U-boat, that's what they would do. And there's a lot of history about that that's what happened. So Gallery had that in his mind that if he could just figure out a way of forcing a U-boat to the surface, and he did that by having his crewmen on the destroyer escorts. They found the U-boat with sonar. They confirmed it was a U-boat, and they started pounding it with depth charges and what they called hedgehog attacks, which was basically mortar shells. Unlike a depth charge, which is preset to a predetermined depth before they explode, the hedgehog mortar shells needed to, to have impact, physical impact with the hull of a U-boat before it exploded. In any event, the depth charge attack definitely worked. It ended in the hull of U-505 being breached, and the rudder was jammed. So the captain, now the third captain of U-505, had no choice really but to surface and surrender. Now, he could have had the option of surfacing and attempting to take down as many U.S. warships as he could. But even though he was a member of the Nazi Party, based on my research, it didn't seem that he was a fanatic. He didn't want to die, as I say, for the Fuhrer.
Mhm.
And also the fact that his rudder was jammed meant that basically the U-505 was inoperable. He couldn't really aim a torpedo and expect it to hit anything unless it was a brilliantly lucky chance. So the plan was working. Here you have the U-boat surfacing. Gallery, according to his plan of attack, told his various destroyer escorts to continue firing at U-505, but only with small arms fire. So the goal was not to blow up U-505. It was to force the German sailors to abandon ship, climb overboard and with life preservers and wait for them to be picked up in the Atlantic. Now, having said this, the Germans were obligated to make every effort to scuttle the boat. I mean, you don't surrender your boat in the face of an enemy attack without first you don't give up the ship. I mean,
Mhm.
that's just basic.
Mm.
So what happened there is just an extraordinary lucky chain of events that ended in and we can get into that. They abandoned ship all according to plan, but they failed to scuttle the U-boat because they were so under such heavy fire to abandon ship that they just panicked. And also the captain was shot and his executive officer was shot. So there was really no one in command. It was a totally chaotic
Mm.
situation. And they also failed to set the 14 demolition charges that would have guaranteed that the vessel would go down to the bottom of the ship before any potential boarding by the U.S. Navy.
Wow, this is incredible. It's all working out exactly as Gallery had planned and hoped it would. So at that point, did they just surrender en masse, or was it still like a fight to the finish, so to speak?
It was at that point that once Gallery saw U-505 surfacing and he could see with his binoculars the German sailors bailing in their life preservers. Some of them were on rafts and they were waiting to be picked up by the U.S. destroyers. It was at that point that the key aspect of this very innovative plan took place. And as I say, all five destroyer escorts had organized a raiding party that consisted of 9 volunteer sailors. It just so happened that the closest destroyer escort to U-505 was the USS Pillsbury. So these 9 sailors, who were obviously aware of this battle taking place, suddenly heard the commanding officer of the USS Pillsbury, based on Gallery's instructions, call out the phrase, "Away boarders." And we talked about the War of 1812. Not since the War of 1812, in 1814, had that phrase been uttered by a U.S. naval commanding officer. And they really couldn't believe they had trained for this moment, but they couldn't believe that this was actually happening because they were laughing about it. They were, prior to this event, in terms of their weeks of training, they were saying, yeah, like, right, the Germans are going to give up. Like, this is really going to work. Another cockamamie idea from Captain Gallery. There it is. They hear the call on the loudspeaker, "Weigh all boarders." They run to a whaleboat. They bring all their equipment on board, consisting of weaponry and toolboxes and chains and other pieces of heavy equipment. And 9 sailors climb on board. The whaleboat is lowered into the Atlantic and proceeds to zip along about 3,000 yards to where U-505 was positioned.
My gosh. I'm thinking about that away borders command that you mentioned. I've never been in the Navy, but I know how steeped in tradition they are. That must have been just incredibly thrilling to know that they were about to board an enemy vessel as had not happened in over a century. I'm sure that they knew probably before this that it had been that long since they'd taken one. So a tense moment, but incredibly thrilling as well to be a part of history like that.
Well, they realized they knew that I think that first reaction, based on my research and talking to various their family members, is that the first reaction was, "Huh? Is this really happening?" And their second reaction was realizing that, yes, it's happening as they're on the whaleboat. And they saw an interesting thing. They saw the commanding officer of the Pillsbury give a, you talk about Navy tradition, make a motion with his kind of a crossbow motion with his arms, his raised arms. And that was actually the signal farewell. So the commanding officer was basically, he was paying tribute to these sailors and perhaps didn't expect them to ever return.
Oh my
No
God.
one knew what to expect. So they're passing. Imagine this image: they're on the whaleboat, which is a like a 22-foot long boat, a motorized boat, and they're passing all these German sailors who are struggling to stay afloat, struggling for survival. Some of the Germans call that in English, "Save me, comrade, save me."
Hmm.
But they stuck to their mission. They also knew that the Germans were going to be rescued later on by other whaleboats. They found themselves at U-505 and they hooked up a hook line to U-505 and one by one proceeded to climb on board. And imagine that, there's heavy waves. It was a kind of a rough late morning, early afternoon in the Atlantic. The top deck was slippery with water and also the blood of the Germans who had been shot during their efforts at escaping. And the first sailor to attempt to climb from the whaleboat to U-505 struggled. His bad luck, he fell in the water and was squeezed between the whaleboat and U-505, and he was the first casualty of the operation.
Oh man.
Fortunately, they managed to pull him out and save him, but he found himself unconscious on a really severely injured back,
Hmm.
laying on top of the U-505. When that happened, also, a lot of his equipment, he was kind of a big muscular guy. He was a gunner's mate, fell into the ocean. So it did not start very well. Now, with 8 sailors, they managed to all get on board. And here's where the real bravery starts happening. So there they are on the conning tower of U-505, and they're looking down into the hatch. And inside, it's pure black. They can't see anything. So the battle plan was to have one of the gunner's mate go down first with a Tommy gun and take down any German sailors who were left on board. But the leader of the boarding party, a man named Lieutenant Albert David, pulled him back and said, "No, let me go." So he wanted to. It was very brave on his part. He wanted to be the first one down and take whatever fate awaited him. And they fully expected the U-boat to be filled with German sailors who would presumably shoot down the Americans. And they also expected it to blow up at any moment. Navy intelligence had briefed them on the fact that there were 14 demolition charges
Hmm.
inside the U-boat. So he climbs down the ladder. He's looking around. He sees this crazy display of German U-boat machinery and engines and whirling about. And where are the Germans? Well, they're not there. Then he calls for his other men to come down. So one by one, they proceeded to come down the ladder. The problem now was that there was an effort to scuttle the German U-boat. The last man out, a German sailor named Hans Gobler, did remove a sea strainer. In the American Navy, it could also be called a seacock. Remove the clamps and you create a hole in the U-boat, and out was gushing a 5-foot stream of ocean water. So the first order of business was to close up that hole. Gobler had succeeded in puncturing a hole in the U-boat, and the Americans had to somehow plug it up. And it was just, again, providence, the good Lord looking down on them, luck, whatever you want to call it. They actually found the cover of the sea strainer just nearby the leak, the hole in the U-boat. So they clamped it back down and they plugged the hole. Now the U-boat is still in danger of sinking, but the immediate problem had been successfully fixed. Then they proceeded to locate the treasures. It wasn't gold and silver like it was a pirate ship. No, it was the Enigma machine and the German secret codes. Now imagine their shock when they found the Enigma machine, but more importantly, their shock when they found the secret code books. These code
Yeah.
books were designed to disintegrate. All the Germans had to do was throw a bucket of water on top of the codes and it would evaporate, it would disappear, it would be gone, useless. Or they could take the codes with them and throw them overboard because they were filled with lead lined cover. They would sink to the bottom of the ocean. But the Germans, in their panic, never did any of that.
Hmm.
So they spent the next few minutes on U-505, the Americans, just filling their sea bags with the Enigma machine, secret codes, and all sorts of stuff. And they created a kind of a human chain, so they would pass all their findings from one sailor to another, up the ladder, and they were all hurriedly thrown into in the waiting whaleboat. Interesting kind of factoid. He was not a member of the raiding party, but he was very brave. The operator of the whaleboat, he saw this thing being thrown at him and he puts it on the whaleboat and it was getting filled and filled and filled and filled. He's thinking, wow, I'm not going to have enough room for all this stuff. And he looked at this box and he wondered, well, this doesn't look like much. Maybe I should throw it overboard. It was the Enigma machine.
Oh my
Fortunately
God.
for the Allied forces, he did not, because it was by then closed, so you couldn't see that it was a futuristic design filled with all the spaghetti wires and electronics and other gizmos.
Wow. 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 Yeah, just a heavy wooden box at that point, a wooden crate. Anyway,
Right.
man, my gosh. Hard to imagine how things would have changed if he had just made a slightly different decision, but thank goodness he didn't. So everything is going great. They were able to actually salvage the ship itself. I mean, the boat itself, they were able to keep it from fully sinking and tow it. I mean, did they have to tow it all the way back to the American East Coast at that point?
After mining the U-boat for the gold mine of intelligence information, the next chore, the next step in the operation was to bring back this fully intact, battered but fully intact German U-boat to the U.S. And because it was filled with new German technology, and let's face it, Germans know engineering, and the Americans wanted to see the latest version of U-boat technology. Just as important, maybe even more important, was that the U-boat was loaded with acoustical torpedoes, which were really creating havoc among Allied shipping because these acoustic torpedoes could be poorly aimed, but they would reach their target because it was able to pick up the sound of propellers and blow up the Allied ships.
Mm-hmm.
After Gallery radioed that he had successfully seized U-505, and you can imagine the maybe uproar is the wrong word, but the shock that the Atlantic Fleet admiral saw when he read that transcript, because he just didn't expect it, and it was a little unclear as to whether he was even aware that Gallery had set out on this mission. There's a lot of mystery about that.
Hmm.
It took several hours for them to kind of figure it out, and they radioed Gallery that he should tow U-505 clear across the Atlantic. Bear in mind, this is taking place off the coast of West Africa, so he had to tow it clear across the Atlantic Ocean to Bermuda, which was then a British colony. It was the longest tow in U.S. naval history. The Navy did send oil tankers because by then Gallery was really, and his task force was running out of oil, and also a tugboat, ocean-going tugboat, and they were able to attach a tow line to U-505 and under great secrecy successfully brought in Bermuda.
Wow. Wow. So you mentioned under great secrecy. I mean, clearly this was an enormous operation with thousands of people involved. I mean, they were, able to see the U-boat surface and the boarding party go on and everything. So how long were they able to actually keep this secret from Germany and also, less importantly, like the American public?
The mission, which was such a great achievement on the part of Gallery and his men, would have gone up in flames had the German high command been made aware that U-505 had been captured. So above all else, it had to be kept secret. And the Brits were particularly concerned about this because bear in mind that they had successfully deciphered the Enigma machine, even though it had the issues that we've talked about. And Fleet Admiral King, who ran the U.S. Navy during World War II, he was just fit to be tied. I mean, he had a blowtorch temper, and he actually threatened to court-martial Gallery. He had not
Oh,
been
wow.
made aware that this operation was taking place. It could have been a disaster for the Allied war effort because had the Germans found out that their Enigma machine and their code books had been compromised, well, it threatened to end Alan Turing's and the British operations ultra secret, which was so enormous and successful to the Allied war effort. So, above all else, the secrecy had to be maintained. And what Gallery did was every sailor in Task Force 22.3, 3,000 sailors actually saw this battle. And he had each of them sign an oath that they would maintain the secret until the end of the war under penalty of death. Bear in
Hmm.
mind, this is a time of war, and he actually did make that threat. And it worked. I mean, these men were, they were fighting for the existence of freedom and democracy and the American way of life, and they knew what was at stake. So it's really a credit to those sailors who witnessed this historic event taking place. That, so far as is known, not one of them uttered a word to any of their friends and family members. And imagine, when they finally came back, when they're on shore leave, and they had the greatest war story of all time, but they couldn't say a word. And
Exactly. Yeah.
again, it's part of the character of these men that they were able to maintain that secret. And it was only after surrender in 1945 that the Navy revealed that U-505 had been captured. And believe me, it was quite the sensation,
Oh,
that
I'll bet.
report.
I'll bet. I'll bet. So because they had the code books and they were undamaged, and because they had the Enigma, did that mean that they were able to start listening in on messages like immediately? I mean, how thoroughly were they able to kind of penetrate German communications once they had these treasures, as you called them, in hand?
It took a little while for U-505 and all the intelligence papers and the Enigma machine and code books to find their way to Washington. The Guadalcanal had to cross the Atlantic. A tugboat was towing U-505. It landed in Bermuda. A team of high-ranking naval officers flew down to Bermuda and flew back that same day with a large number of seed bags filled with this material. And the analysis started right away. It is an interesting anecdote. Gallery assigned one of his officers to accompany the seed bag, and he actually signed for it. And then he was called over to the Pentagon, and he found himself, there's this young officer from a small town in Kentucky who still spoke with this, Kentuckian accent, and he's there debriefing Fleet Admiral King and now also actually Admiral McCain of the McCain military dynasty,
Hmm.
who are hanging on his every word because they were just astounded by this amazing adventure. In the end, it turned out to be the real deal. Gallery has succeeded in plundering the current cipher codes for the entire German U-boat fleet in the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans for the last 2 weeks of June 1944. And this is of particular historic importance because, bear in mind, D-Day took place 2 days after the raiding party on U-505. And obviously, being able to read the German code books for those eventful weeks immediately following the D-Day invasion was quite meaningful. It meant that the Allied code breakers were able to read the U-boat messages in real time as fast as the Germans received them, and that freed up. I think the estimate was about 13,000 hours of precious decoding computer time in those all-important weeks of following the D-Day invasion. And then they also obtained in the raid the cipher code that was scheduled to go into effect in mid-July
Hmm.
that laid out the Enigma machine settings for all U-boats and Nazi surface machines. And then they had the code books that were going to start on August 1st, 1944. And the reason for this is that one of the reasons why the German High Command believed that their code was unbreakable is that they constantly changed them. So this is of enormous intelligence value, having to be the ability to read the code books right through mid-August 1944 in real time.
Wow. Wow. So did that lead to like a big update in U-boat interceptions, like where the destroyer was able to home in on them much faster than they previously had? They kind of knew their routes or anything, or did it just mean that they were able to triangulate their position, something like that afterwards?
Right. This is interesting historical question. Gallery, even though he was so into self-promotion, deservedly so, He never really believed that it shortened the war, but other people did believe it
Hmm.
shortened the war. And the fact is that an estimated 300 U-boats were sunk by Allied forces between mid-June 1944, when U-505 was seized, and the end of the war. That's a lot of sinking.
Yeah, no question about it. That's an enormous loss of personnel and material and effective weapons right when Germany certainly needed them the most. Incredible stuff. So,
Yeah.
as you mentioned right at the beginning, Charles, the U-505 itself wound up in a museum in Chicago. So, how in the world did they get it from Bermuda to Chicago after the war ended?
After the Navy revealed, this is in 1945, that U-505 had been captured, they took the submarine on a war bond drive. Bear in mind that the war in the Pacific against Japan was still ferocious and ongoing. And it was only VE Day, Victory in Europe, that the war in Europe was over. They brought it from East Coast port to port to port. They allowed people on board to inspect this captured German vessel. It was a sensation. They raised a lot of money for the war bond effort. And then they brought U-505 to the Navy port in Maine. And the original plan of action was to destroy it, to blow it up, to use it for target practice, as all other U boats in the German fleet that had been seized after the war was done to them. But when Gallery heard that, he threw a fit. He realized its enormous historical importance in the annals of Navy history. So he put pressure on the Navy to, okay, we don't know what to do with it, but don't destroy it. So for about 10 years, it sat there in Maine, rusting. It was so dangerous to actually board that there was a sign put up that no boarding permitted. And then Gallery's brother, the Roman Catholic priest, who was a big deal in Chicago, was determined to bring this now legendary U-boat to Chicago, to the Museum of Science and Industry. Gallery, by then a rear admiral, used his influence in the Navy Department, and he enlisted the help of the McCormick family, which was the powerful publisher of the Chicago Tribune. And a campaign ensued to raise money, private funds, to purchase the U-boat from the Navy and also to make it seaworthy. And by an act of Congress, the title of ownership of U-505 was transferred to the Museum of Science and Industry. So the next chore was, how do you bring it to Chicago? I managed to sail it above the surface the entire way through 4 Great Lakes, and it ended up in Lake Michigan. And then one night in 1954, they, using some great engineering skills, were able to lift it out of Lake Michigan and carry it across Lakeshore Drive into the backyard of the Museum of Science and Industry. And there it was there for a number of years as a very popular exhibit. And then they were able to build this permanent exhibit on level 4 inside the museum, where it would be protected from all the harsh Chicago weather elements. And
Hmm.
there it is till today.
Incredible. Incredible. And you're able to walk inside of it, you said? Is that right?
Yes, you're able to see it from the outside, but the real thrill is being patient enough to wait for a tour to go inside. And there you see really how extraordinary it is that men could live in this environment.
Wow. Well, that is fantastic. I'm going to have to make a trip out there for sure now. This is such exciting stuff.
For sure, I urge you to do it.
I definitely will. I definitely will. Well, thank you, Charles. This is an incredible story, and I'm so glad that you researched it and wrote it for the rest of us out here who would not have any idea of all this that went on before that. For those of you who are listening, the book is called Codename Nemo: The Hunt for a Nazi U-Boat and the Elusive Enigma Machine by Charles Lachman, and it's already out right now. It's available as you're listening to this. We've only covered, honestly, a fraction of this story because there's so much more. And some of the most interesting to me, honestly, was about the U-boat crew themselves. I felt like we got to go know them pretty well because there was so much documentation that Charles was able to dig up about them. So really, really interesting look at life on the other side during the war. And I really encourage you to pick this up and read it. Charles, thank you so much for your time. Are you working on another book now that you've got this one published? Or are you taking a little time to yourself or what exactly?
I am working on a new World War II book, but I'm very much in the early stages. I finished Codename Nemo book, a number of months ago, just waiting for the pub date to come
Mm-hmm.
out, and do some marketing. But yeah, I'm working on an exciting World War II trilogy, and Codename Enigma was the first, and
Oh,
I'm
wow.
working on the second one. So fingers crossed.
Okay, fantastic. Are you ready to share anything about that yet, or you want to hold off until you're closer to
I
publishing?
think no writer likes talking about what he's working on. I got to get it done first.
That's very true. I've had a lot of authors on here, and they love to talk about what they've already written, and they never talk about what they are writing currently.
Okay, I'll stick to
So
that.
no surprise there. Well, I'm looking forward to that, Charles. I mean, I love World War II, of course, and this book, if it's related to Codename Nemo, as you said, I'm certainly looking forward to it as well. So really appreciate your time, and hope that everybody will read this and enjoy it as much as I have.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your interest in it.
Absolutely. Do you have any public social media pages or website or anything like that you can share if people want to follow along with the progress with the next book, for example?
The book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all the other Walmart and all the traditional book-selling sites. I have an author page. You can find me at charleslachman.com, and I'll be putting up updates as the weeks and months go along.
Okay, fantastic. We'll link that up in the show notes for you as well, so people can just click on the link when they've listened to this episode. Well, thanks for your time, Charles. I really appreciate it, and thank you for getting this book into my hands and sharing this knowledge with the rest of us.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
You too.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.